Hello, everybody, and welcome to Experience Talks, our Zoom cast. This is our special show to celebrate National Poetry Month, and I'm really happy to have three amazing artists on the show today. Melanie Luja, Paul Cummins, and Taalam Acey. Welcome to Experience Talks, all three of you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna read brief bios on these three people, but these bios do not fully contain the greatness therein. So I invite you to visit experiencetalks.org, and there are larger bios and links to their work and the stuff that they do. I want to start with Melanie Luja. Melanie Luja, known creatively as Queen Socks, is a soul work practitioner, life purpose coach, educator, author, and award-winning poet. She is also the co-founder of the Vibrations Enrichment Group, which focuses on alkaline education, and the Balance Portal, a private practice in Southern California, where the aim is alternative soul care. With the release of the book, Internal Balance, Would You Marry You, alongside her husband, O'Shea Luja, Melanie has brought another level of philosophical truths into a synergy designed to balance a person's universe internally and externally. As a wife, mother of five, and entrepreneur, Melanie has also found time to become a doula, author, herbalist, non-denominational minister, and an accredited cosmetologist, Reiki master, and soul work therapist. And every time I read about or hear about Melanie, it makes me tired and makes me want to get off my ass and do something with my life. Say that out loud. Dr. Paul Cummins is an educator, innovator, author, and poet. In 1971, Paul co-founded Crossroads School in Santa Monica and built it into one of Los Angeles' most successful educational institutions. In 1995, Paul stepped down as headmaster of Crossroads and formed New Visions Foundation, now the Coalition for Engaged Education, whose first venture was the creation of New Roads School, a diverse K-12 independent school. He co-founded 6 schools in all and has implemented many innovative programs in LA to help children at risk. He's most recently co-founder and senior seminar English teacher at Tree Academy. Paul has published 4 books on education, 4 books of and on poetry, and 2 children's books. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Tim.
Taalam Acey is a poet, independent artist, and educator. The legendary Stevie Wonder said while interviewing Taalam during his own birthday celebration in 2008, "You have so much inspired me with your spoken word." Taalam is an independent artist whose work has been featured on TV1 and the Documentary Channel and was selected as the original #1 thing you need to know about on BET's countdown show, The 5. His poetry has appeared in Essence magazine, and he performed at the Essence Music Festival in New Orleans. Taalam has recorded 16 CDs and authored 7 books. Additionally, films that include his work have garnered an Audience Award and a special jury prize at the Sundance Film Festival. Taalam, welcome.
Wow. Wow.
Exactly. Wow, that's why we're here. So I want to start out by having each of you read a piece of your work, and then talk a little bit about kind of the origin story with us. Melanie, do you want to kick us off? Give us a piece.
Why not? In this melting pot, we mold ourselves together so they don't have to touch us. We mohawk our way through doorways, for we now know where we are going. We wear hula hoops in our ears so that we no longer have to jump through them, for we are now certain that material things aren't the things that hold us together. We are held together because we choose to be, for we are now certain of our destinations. We've battled for dialogue when the voices of our elders is so much more important than what we have to say. Shh, the ancestors are speaking. And if we listen, we will remember their stories.
Fantastic. What's the inspiration there, Melanie?
Well, you know, when you start to look at us as an ebony people and what we've experienced in our lives, we have to get to the point where we realize that there is certain things that happen systematically, but then there are certain things that happen internally, right? And a lot of times we deal with the external aspect, but we never deal with the internal aspect the way that is important for us to change as an individual so that we can be an effective change outside of self. So that's where the inspiration behind that poem came from.
Very cool. Beautiful, beautiful stuff.
Thank you.
Paul, hit us with
Okay.
something.
Okay, I'm going to read a sonnet, and the inspiration of it should be pretty obvious. So I won't have to talk too much afterwards. But anyway, I have a slightly longer one. If we have time, I'd like to squeeze in because it's not quite as topical. So this is titled "The Knee," a sonnet. Now we must needs add a new name to the list. Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, MLK, Malcolm X, Trayvon Martin, Rodney King, Breonna Taylor, and on and on and on. Our National Hall of Shame, our reverse Vietnam Memorial, martyrs without monuments. And now, with knees upon our necks, we have come to see 400 years of brutality laid bare, reruns over and over there to see. The almost bored expression on the policeman's face, a public lynching on pavement for all to see, as if to say, nothing new, just biz as usual. So let's add to our list of victims in the void a new name, a name of destiny, Mr. George Floyd.
Mm.
Wow. How recently did you write that, Paul?
About I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, I think. The reason for reading it today is kind of obvious.
Yeah,
But
it's a better day to read it than it was 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, I like the last line now, a new name, a name of destiny, Mr. George Floyd, because I think he's influenced American history pretty dramatically. At least I like to think that will be true.
Yes, yes. Let's hope. Taalam, how about you?
Sure. What if this is God's work? What if real poets walk the earth and live lives fit for prophets, birth spreading ancient wisdom like the Coptic Church, and those that know what they're hearing know that they're hearing something special. And perhaps eventually a poet to be sent here just to bless you, test you in this world of lies. And if you feel your eyes cry because they recognize that what they're seeing is the truth. And the chills up your spine provide absolute proof that in this now, where politicians and clergy are proving themselves unworthy of your time, and television shows and music videos are proving themselves unworthy of your mind, don't be surprised to find that God is especially present in poetry dens, guiding poets' pens, and not just those men who pretend to be closer to God than you by making you ashamed of your sins. The lives that they've lived may not have been what God intends for your salvation. What if this is God's work? What if the Creator realizes that the creation isn't perfect, but only wishes for us to worship sincerely, to not be hypocrites, but to really be concerned about our fellow man, to stand up against injustices falsely perpetuated in God's name in foreign lands? What if this is God's work? And if so, then the poets are closer to Muhammad, Buddha, and Jesus than the preachers. I said, the poets are closer to Muhammad, Buddha, and Jesus than the preachers. I mean, think about it, y'all. Which of us are living closer to the streets, and which of us are living closer to Caesar? Which of us are living high up on the hog? And which of us are the poor righteous teachers? What if this is God's work? And so, then poetry is sacred. So you poets be concerned when you step on this stage with and be on your job, because if this is God's work, then stealing from another poet is the same thing as stealing from God. And it's not about your use of sexuality or profanity. It's about whether you use your tools for ahs and oohs, or whether you use your tools to improve humanity. What if this is God's work? And I know blasphemous have hell to pay. So I wouldn't say anything tonight, Tim, that I wouldn't be comfortable repeating on Judgment Day. What if this is God's work, y'all? Let us pray.
Wow. Amazing. Talk about the inspiration behind that, Taalam. That's amazing.
The inspiration behind it is funny. I did the poem on a Zoomcast within the last week. And there was a gentleman on the Zoomcast who was one of the reasons why I wrote the poem. At the time, there were two people in Baltimore who wrote poems that really touched me. And I just wasn't sure that they felt the appreciation that I thought they deserved. And what I was trying to tell them is that it's not so much about the applause and what people like in the moment. I felt like they were writing poems that were going to last for people's entire life experience, and I wanted to encourage them. That's where that poem came from.
Fantastic. It's a great segue into the first question I have to you all to open a conversation about poetry. So talk about what first inspired you all to become a poet. What was it about poetry, poets, poems, words, the use of words, the use of lyrical prose, the performance aspect of it, whatever it is about this art form? What was the first thing that bit you about this, that got into your blood? Paul, you want to start us off?
Oh boy, I'm the wrong person to start us out, because I came about it in ways that I would not recommend to anybody else. I was listening earlier to Melanie's daughter read this wonderful poem that is online, and she was singing her poetry that was gorgeous. This is a 5-year-old reading this extraordinary poem, and it had rhythm, and it had a certain lyrical quality to it and passion and so on. And it came out of a culture that is so much richer than the culture I came out of. I came out of a white Brentwood. I don't know if any of you know where Brentwood is, but it's sort of the epitome of conservative Republican American materialism and so on. And there was no poetry in my home, my family. And then I was sent off to Stanford thinking I was going to play football, which was a joke. But it was interesting that Stanford, on my freshman team, there were 75 of us that tried out, not one Black student. This was 1955. And so Stanford was an all white place. And I didn't I came into poetry through academia. I was looking for a doctoral dissertation to write, and my chairman and I kind of hit upon the poetry of Richard Wilbur, who is, as everybody, or as this group knows, a very traditionalist, academic, formalist poetry, a master of rhyme. His poems are highly structured and highly traditional and so on. And so that was sort of my introduction to poetry. And then I found myself trying to write poems like Richard Wilbur, and they were just god awful. They were terrible. And it's taken me a very long time to try and find a voice that's my own. So the voice wasn't there in the culture. It's one that I've had to learn by going to an occasional workshop. And I had a wonderful mentor, a poet named Peter Levitt, who used to try to find ways to trick me out of my head into my heart and my emotions and the place where poetry, decent and good poetry, comes from. But it's been an uphill struggle for me. But I've fallen in love with the process. So I write every day now, and I'm semi-retired. Tim read the various things I've done. I'm still teaching a couple hours a week, but I'm 83 years old now, and so I've slowed down a bit, but I write poetry every day. And every now and then I hit on something that I think works. And that's what keeps bringing me back to the table. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Great, that's great. Taalam, what about you? What was the bug that bit you?
Poetry, in my case, was it was always with me, thrust upon me. The book collection that my parents had when I was born was mostly or largely poetry, mostly Black Renaissance figures. So your Countee Cullen, your Langston Hughes, your Claude McKay, your Arna Bontemps, and my father and mother were members of Mary Baraka's organization. So, poetry readings were a common thing from before I could read. And as I mentioned, the books were poetry. So that was what my mother read to me as bedtime stories, that even some of the Langston Hughes simple stories that weren't poetry. And I just grew up with it. You know what I mean? My first steps were taken in that organization, the Community for Unified New York, which was Mary Baraka's organization. My first literal walking steps. And so I didn't necessarily, it's just been there. And because that was what my mother read to me when I first started reading at 4, that was what I read. So it's always been around, and sometimes more in the forefront than others, right? So in the late 70s and early 80s, when I wanted to be cool to my friends, I did not mention poetry, right? But then there were times when it was more apropos. So that's where it came from for me.
Oh, I'm so envious of you.
This is fantastic.
Thank you.
Melanie, how about you?
Tim, I have been asked this question over and over again for many years, and I think that the answer had changed quite a few times, but I think that this time I remember the very moment. And I remember being in elementary school in the late 70s and wanting to join a competition on stage because I always wanted to play an instrument, but I was always so small,
Anna?
I could barely hold the instruments, So I got my hands on the Phenomenal Woman poem by Maya Angelou. And if I can remember correctly, I had to be like about in the 2nd grade, and I joined a poetry competition and read Maya Angelou's poem, and I saw how it affected the entire crowd. And what was interesting after that is I didn't consider myself a poet. I considered myself a writer, and I would do theater. But I ran far away from being a poet because that would mean I would have to speak my own words and my own truth, right? So what I would do is I would write poetry in notebooks, and I would hide them, right? And so I remember in high school, my mom found one of my notebooks tucked under the couch cushion, and she read it all. And I walked in from school one day, and she was sitting there in tears. And I was like, are you okay? She said, I didn't know that you wrote poetry. And I was thinking to myself, I didn't either. At that point, I felt kind of, I don't know, violated. Is a strong word, but I felt like somebody finally saw the innermost insides of me. So I remember taking my notebook to school with me when I was in college at Santa Monica College, and the teacher walked up while I was reading it one day, and I stuck it under the desk and lost it and could not find it ever. I never found it. So at that point, a dear friend of mine, his name is Javon, he was one of my college friends. He would always encourage me to start writing poetry again. And I'm like, I'm not a poet. And then finally he forced me to go to an open mic venue. And he was like, you're gonna get on the stage one day. And so I could not memorize my poetry the way that other artists were memorizing their poetry. So I was a little apprehensive. And then one day I asked myself, where are you when you're writing your poetry? Where's your most comfortable space? And so I realized it was at home in my socks. So I started to get on the stage at poetry venues with my socks on and imagining I was in that place. And that's when I started reciting poetry in public. So
It's
yeah.
fantastic. And birth of the socks as with your handle.
That's where the name Queen Socks came from. I was walking down the street one day, and someone was walking behind me, and they said Queen Socks, and I wanted to know who this person was because I had been hearing about her. I didn't know that was the name that the poetry community had given me. So when he said that, I turned around to see who she was, and then I realized I was the only person there. So I was like, oh, I'm Socks. And so the community of poetry named me Queen Socks.
That's fantastic. So the next thing I want to know is about poetry and what it means. In the film Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams plays a teacher, and he asks his students, why do we read and write poetry? So I want to put that question to all of you. Why do we read and write poetry? What is poetry for? Why do we need it? Taalam, you want to start us off? Taalam, you're on mute, brother.
I live in a flight path, so sometimes I've been muting it if a loud airplane goes by. To me, poetry and communication are pretty similar words. In poetry, you're trying to communicate. There's a meme that I dislike where they say, you can communicate all you want. It doesn't mean that people will understand you. And the reason why I dislike the meme is I think it's a complete misunderstanding of what communicate means, right? Communication, as they told us, is not so much what you think you said, but what the other person thought they heard. So poetry is a means of, for me, it's a means of digging deep, of finding things that I really care about. And I think that maybe no one else would put it in the light that I would, in communicating it to people, to see it in that light, to see it as clearly as I can translate it using language, what I feel, for them to see what I feel, for them to feel what I feel. So poetry is, I like to refer to it as energy transfer. So it's a way of using language to transfer energy.
Fantastic. Melanie, what about you? What do you think?
I love what Taalam just said, that transfer. For me, it was a means of being able to be completely heard, because as a child, I spoke very fast. And it was because I found that I wasn't able to always get my whole sentence out, right? So when I would write, I would be able to get my complete thought out and then be able to offer that complete thought. And I realized that a lot of times people get into arguments and they're not really in an argument. They're just so busy thinking about what they have to say next that they don't hear what the other person said. And like Taalam was saying, with communication, the way I understood it was that it's giving and receiving simultaneously. So if I can offer you this and you can receive something from it and we can communicate this way, it gives people an opportunity to express themselves in an arena that they probably otherwise wouldn't be able to get their complete thought out.
Love that. I love that. Paul, what about you?
Well, I love what what the two of you poets said just before me, and I would agree with that. For me, in poetry, you say things that you can't say any other way, and if you could say it another way, then you probably should be writing a paragraph or a prose or an essay or a book of nonfiction or whatever. And that's been a real struggle with me, because a lot of my poems are idea driven, topically driven, event driven, driven by something that's happened in the world that I'm living in. But I find I can't say what I want to say about it if I just sit down and try to write an essay. I remember once W.H. Auden said, if you have something to say, you're probably not going to be a poet. But if you like the way words bounce up against each other, and you like the sound of words and you like to play with them, then maybe there's a chance for you. So I've struggled with that, because sometimes what I have to say becomes more important than the saying of it. And then I realized this isn't the poem. This isn't working. But when I get into a certain place, I find that an hour later, I don't know where I've been, but the words on the page are a whole lot better than if I had sat down and done an outline and tried to write an essay. And then that particular collection of words might work as a poem. But I throw away far more than I keep. And for every one poem that I have printed out, and at the end of the year, Tim knows this because I've been sending my stuff to him for a long time. I publish 15, 20, 25, whatever it is, poems I've written that year. I self-publish them, and then I mail them out to friends and colleagues. And I find that for the most part, they like it. And one of the reasons they like it is I find dangerous. One of the reasons they like what I write is because they understand it. And of course, they're in vogue today are these poems that you see published in Poetry Magazine or the New Yorker or whatever, where the imagery and the metaphors or whatever are so complicated that who the hell understands them? I mean, I read poetry moderately well. I teach it, and I read poems in various poetic journals today, and I don't know what the poet is talking about. So I wonder, who is he or she trying to communicate with? Well, I try to communicate with an audience out there, and I don't know who they are, but a friend of mine once said that poetry is a conversation between strangers. And so you put your poem out there, and you don't know who's going to read it or what impact it's going to have, and you have the faith that maybe somebody will react to it, and maybe it'll affect them in some way. So that's what keeps me going every day.
It's fantastic. All three of you are educators, grizzled educators, and each of you, in the description of what poetry is and why it works, there's an ethereal quality to it that's hard to grasp. So how do we teach poetry? How do we teach poetry to our children? Melanie knows, Paul knows, I work with elders. How do we teach people who don't have a voice to use poetry as a voice to speak what they need to say? Melanie, you want to give it a start?
Well, before I do, if it's okay, I would like to add on to what Paul was saying. I remember listening to an interview from Gil Scott-Heron, and he was saying that, a lot of times he reads his poetry that he just can't wrap it around. He doesn't know what it is. He said the best way to deal with the situation like that, Paul, is to look at the artist and say, wow, that must be deep.
If you can't understand it, it's deep, huh?
It must be deep. But as far as the educational aspect of it, what I realized is that when you start to really think about life in general, we know that life operates in a particular rhythm. We know that the phone number is the set up the way that it is because in 3-digit rhythms and then the 4-digit rhythm, it creates something that helps you to memorize it a little bit better, right? So with that, there is a rhythm to each person, right? And then when you start to think about the person as an individual being able to tap into particular frequencies that help them to understand, what's going on. And one of the things that we always teach the students is that when you put your finger in front of your face and you put it really close, we ask them, what do you see? They say, I see something blurry. I said, now pull your finger back. What do you see? And they start to describe their finger. So when they describe their finger, it gives them an opportunity to see that sometimes when you're too close into the situation, you can't see things clearly. But when you take a moment and you step back from the situation, you can see things clearly and you can start to communicate things to people who would never understand what it is that's going on inside of you. And the movie Ghost was a really good segue for me because when he wanted to taste the apple, he couldn't taste it. And she had to describe to him, what exactly is that like? I don't know what it's like to taste that, And so with the children, we're able to say, okay, if I say this, what's your response? Because children are very clever. And when they're given a little bit of encouragement, then you get to see how clever they truly are when they're in not being inhibited, right? And so, Love, like Paul was saying before, is a poet. And a lot of times she has a book that is due to come out at the end of this month. And so with her, what I did was I sat down with her and I said, okay, let's talk about hair. right? And so she said, okay. I said, what do you think about it? And she already thinks in a rhythm form, right? Not always rhyme, but definitely rhythm. So with that rhythm, we started to create this masterpiece that she decided to call Hair Formations, but allowing them to be as creative as they could possibly be, allowing them to release whatever it is that they feel like is being trapped. You know, children are constantly told to be seen and not heard. And so we like to deal with things in a different way. Let me hear you. You know, let me close my eyes and hear you so I can see you with my eyes closed.
Love that. Taalam, what about you?
I think I zoned out into Melanie's response.
Around the idea of educating about poetry, how do we teach people how to do this? Is it teachable for that matter?
Yeah, I was way into what Melanie was saying, and I just like totally lost the thread.
She has that power, especially when you name your daughter Love and you're telling stories about love.
It just became like a story to me. I'm just like, oh, okay.
I'm with you.
I have a really short response with this. It's just that I think the poetry is in the person already. So therefore, all you can do really is to encourage them to bring it out. It may begin by just encouraging them to write, to brainstorm, to put pen to pad, to just come from the heart. And then you educate them in terms of poetry techniques, right? What is hyperbole? What is rhyme? What is rhythm? When do you use a cadence? When do how do you, what about refrain? What about chorus? What about litany? So on and so forth. So you begin to teach them, the elements of it to sort of educate them about it. And then they can take those tools in the same way someone would use a palette to color in their thoughts even more vividly. You got me?
I love that. I do. Paul, how about you?
Well, I'm with Taalam and Melanie, but I think the important thing initially is to not be judgmental, to get them to be able to put things down on paper before you start throwing the academic stuff at them. And I know typically English teachers will start out by going through a book like Sound and Sense was a book that I read when I started looking at poetry and trying to figure it out. And it's got a chapter on metaphor, a chapter on imagery, a chapter on rhyme, a chapter on this and that. And the typical English teacher will teach what is iambic pentameter and what's an iamb, what's a trochee, what's an anapest, and then give little quizzes on that. And for students, it winds up being boring, and it doesn't connect to anything deep inside themselves. You can teach them that kind of stuff once they get interested in wanting to write poetry and wanting to know more about the craft of it. But you can't start, I don't think, with a preconceived notion of craft and impose that upon them, or you'll lose them right off the bat. So I've written a book on how to teach poetry, and I think it's a pretty decent book. It's called Voice and Verse, and it's it's my sound and sense, but it's a little bit less academic and pedantic than the Sound and Sense, which, by the way, has now gone through 15 editions. Wow. And the guy who originally wrote it, Lawrence Perrine, is long since dead, and one of his graduate students has taken it over, and I'm sure making a good living off of it. But Voice and Verse, the subtitle is The Joys of Reading, Writing, and Teaching Poetry. And if you start from a place of joy, where you, the teacher, are sharing with students, assuming that they like you and that they respect you and see you as any kind of a role model, then I start out with stuff that I love, and I explain to them why I love it. But and sometimes I will get them started if they're having trouble doing what I call emulations, or what everybody calls emulations or imitations. Give them a poem by someone else and say, okay, write your phenomenal woman, but change it to amazing girl. Change the title, the subject matter, but follow the pattern. And that sometimes will get students unstuck and lead them into trying things on their own. So I'm talking too much, so I'll stop there.
Ah, that's great. I love that. I love that. All of you have mentioned things that lead me to believe that it's important to hear poetry as well as it is to read it. You know, that the delivery of poetry seems to be a huge part of it. And a couple of you have mentioned the connective tissue around being together, you know, giving and receiving. Can you talk about the performance aspect of poetry and why that's important? Taalam, you want to start us out on that?
I'm sure. As you were stating that question, it reminded me that poetry, to a large extent in the beginning for me, was just read, right? It was what my mother read to me and what I started reading when I had the ability to read. I did see a lot of poetry performances. They were, when I was a child, they were larger than life. You know, I would go to see poetry, to see plays. Um, so I cut the first stories short in a way. I talked about how I got into poetry, but not how I got into spoken word. I got into spoken word later in life. I got into spoken word in the mid '90s when it was making a comeback. Prior to that, I was into rapping, you know, like a lot of young Black men at the time. And when spoken word came back around, I was interested, but like there was Love Jones was a movie, but it was really kind of like bourgeoisie, the movie. You know, they were really not my kind of folks, right? I was hanging out in dive bars and what older folks were calling watering holes and things like. I wasn't hanging out in like classy swink, you know, clubs and venues like that, like they had in the movie. So when I first went to a spoken word event in my area, I expected that. It was something a friend of mine invited me to. I didn't want to go to it, but he had invited me to something previous that was his birthday that I missed. I felt so bad. I went to the spoken word event and it was different. It was different than the movie. It wasn't, you know, swanky. It was very gritty. It was dark. It was, you know, people who were working class, you know, just like Slam started from the Green Mill, you know, in Chicago from Mark Smith, who was also, he was a construction worker. So even, you know, the Slam scene came about from working class origins. And where we were, our open mics, definitely working class. You really had to bring it. Like Minton's Playhouse with, you know, I want to say Miles Davis, but more than that, your Thelonious Monk, your Kenny Clark, your Charles Parker, right? And you had to bring it. So that's how I got into it. And it made it very clear, if it had not been previously or previous to that, that your performance wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. It was your pauses, your inflections, your tonality, texture of your voice, your smile, your frown, so on and so forth, how you moved or didn't move. You know what I mean? Your pauses, right? How far close you were to the mic, depending on what you were saying and what was going on. You know, you get close to the mic for bass and further away for treble. You know, it was just a lot of things going on. So the performance aspect is very, very key to me because I made a living as a performance poet for like 2 decades. You know, so every different aspect of, and again, it goes back to the energy transfer. How do you transfer the energy? It's not just now about how you wrote it, but how you share it, right? When do you get loud? When do you get soft? When you get on stage, do you start off fast and loud, or do you start off slow and low? You know, and all kinds of different considerations. So the performance adds many, many more variables and can make it more fun for someone who overthinks.
Which describes me to a T. So I need more of that in my life. I overthink. So I agree with you. That's fantastic. I appreciate that. Paul, how about you?
Well, I love what Taalam just said. I want a copy of that, which I think you'll be
Yeah.
sending us a transcript. A poem is meant, I believe, it's a performance. It's not just a solid work of art. I think that poems are meant to be read. I don't, when I get a new volume of poems at home, or when I'm reading some of my favorite poets, I always read them out loud. Because I hear things when I read it out loud that I don't see when I sort of read it silently. So I think a poem is in many ways a performance, and I think what one of the things that drew me to poetry was hearing wonderful performances. I heard W.H. Auden read once, and that voice of his was just extraordinary. I didn't hear him in person, but I listened to Dylan Thomas's recordings frequently. And I think he's just one of the more amazing readers of poetry that I've ever heard. And I did get to hear Robert Frost once toward the end of his life. The performance of the poem just enhances the poem immeasurably. I can't imagine not listening and not hearing the poem and just looking at it and just reading it.
Yeah, I love that. Melanie, how about you?
Did you say something? I'm sorry, I missed one section of what you were saying, Dr. Cummins. Did you mention something about Robert Frost?
Oh yeah, I just mentioned that I was able to hear him read when I was an undergraduate, and I just found it so impressive. And ironically, I was taking a poetry class at the time from a poet named Ivor Winters, who was this academic, very pedantic guy who hated Robert Frost's poetry and tried to convince us in his classroom that it wasn't very good, but I wasn't buying it. I thought it was pretty wonderful.
I had this whole vision in my head where we were talking about Robert Frost, and then I say something like Leaves of Grass, and then you say, no, that's Walt Whitman, and then you shut off your camera because you're fed up. Okay.
I love that. That's great. Melanie, what do you think about the performance aspect of it?
You know, growing up, I had a way of saying things that would kind of agitate my mom a little bit, right? So she would always tell me, listen, little girl, it's not what you say, but how you say it, right? And then my cousin had it even worse. My mother would say, I love you, but I don't like you. So let me help you so I don't have to hurt you, right? So in writing poetry and reciting poetry, those things ring in my head, right? The people listening don't have to like me, you know, but 9 times out of 10, they will love me afterwards, you know? So, because you don't always say things that's going to rub people the right way, but you might be stating facts, right? So a lot of times, because we have a publishing company, Stillwater's Publishing, we publish multiple poets, and it's the most difficult thing to do sometimes, because when we try to show them how to write, the difference between writing for the page versus the stage, it becomes a little uncomfortable because they think you're trying to alter their art, right? Now, I'm a prime example. When I released my first book, Try Walking a Mile in My Socks, I didn't want nobody to alter my poetry, because when I performed it on stage, I got standing ovations. So don't switch it on the page. But, and I'm saying that because O'Shea is the one who really was on me about it. He's like, my love, just put this on this line. But I'm like, no, that's a full sentence. And he's just like, but this is poetry. You're not writing sentences, you know? So when I started seeing how each line could stand alone, right? When you're writing for the page, if each line stands alone, then the reader has a better chance at understanding what it is that you're writing about, you know, because the words can get complicated sometimes. But on stage, that's where your freedom lies. You can say it and present it and offer it however you want to project the feeling that you had behind it. But if a person is reading your work and they've never met you and they probably will never see you, how would they receive it? So that's one of the things that we often deal with, is the difference between writing for the page versus the stage.
And it seems like it's almost two different things, and part of it must change depending on audience reaction and how you feel that day.
Something that Taalam said is so important. So in many poems, the audience or the reader won't get what is being said unless they hear the tone of voice and of the poet. I remember trying to teach a poem by Mae Swenson called "Women," and I taught it to a group of sophomores at UCLA, and the poem was ironic, and it was a woman talking about Mae Swenson talking about men and how men regard women as little hobby horses that when they come home from work they like to ride them, and so on and so on. And the students thought, oh, isn't that wonderful? Behind every man is a supporting, and they completely missed the tone of the poem. It was just bizarre.
That's great. So I want to talk. I have one more question, then I want each of you to give us another piece at the end. I want to talk about poetry and the power of words and social change. You know, we have obviously had a very difficult year plus. You know, it's been a time of great upheaval and division. You know, social justice and pandemic and all of the things that have happened. You know, on the other side of that, poetry is having a damn good year because Amanda Gorman performed at the inauguration at the Super Bowl, and Amanda Gorman is a beloved daughter of Los Angeles, and Paul founded the high school that Amanda Gorman graduated from, and I know Shay and Melanie know her. How can poetry create a platform to connect us and create social change? And can poetry and words cut through this stuff and bring us together? Is that possible? Melanie, what do you think?
I think that it has already done that in plenty of ways, you know, and then I think that there is a lot more to be done. When we talk about poetry being the avenue, one of our Jegnas, Father Amdi, always said that, you know, project the times in your writing, like what's going on now, so that the future can read about what was happening at that time. And so what we always say is that when you come from a place of love, especially when you come from a place of self-love, you can feel your way through certain things. When I graduated from Dorsey High School, and about 20 years after I graduated, there was a bus that was taking a load of children on a camping trip. The bus crashed and plenty of the children passed away. It was very devastating. And so my mom called me, and she was crying. And I asked her, you know, like, did you know somebody on the bus, or did you have a friend who had a child? And she said, no, you went to Dorsey. So every child that goes to Dorsey is my child. And that was probably one of the most poetic things that I could have ever heard, you know? So, you know, with this climate being what it is, if we start to deal with who are we on the inside, right? And then what it is that we need to get out of us so that we can flourish and be even better individuals. And then that is usually the start of connecting to just love yourself into wholeness, so that you can start to see the God in everyone else. And you can only start with self.
Beautiful. I love that. Paul?
Well, you know, I mentioned Auden a little bit ago. Auden very famously once said, "For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in valleys where brokers from the bourse would never want to tamper." Well, I don't think I fully agree with that anymore. Poetry is not only surviving, but it's flourishing but we tend not to recognize it sometimes where it occurs. It occurs in popular songs, and you know, Bob Dylan was given the Nobel Prize a little while back, and some of his songs are pure poetry, and in many popular songs, Broadway musicals, you'll find poetry. In Hamilton, what an extraordinary performance that was. And it's had a big impact on young people who all, more young people, I think, are trying to write rap because they've heard of Hamilton and they've seen it, or they saw the movie, or they've somehow heard it. So poetry exists in many different places. It isn't just in Poetry Magazine or American Poetry Review. It's out there in our community. Now, is it changing the world, Tim? Hard to say. What's going to change this stupid world of ours? We had 4 years of a president who abused language and so egregiously that one of the things that poetry can do is sort of resensitize us to language. Because that man just absolutely butchered the English language, and had a vocabulary I think they estimated of about a third grader. No offense to third graders, but there.
But you just offended every third grader that's listening right now.
Yeah, well, sorry about that. But we need, as a nation, to become resensitized to language, and that's what people who not only write poetry but write songs and musicals and so on are doing, and doing rather well.
Great. Taalam, what do you think?
I really dig both responses that came before me, and to kind of pick up on something that Dr. Cummins said. He was speaking about Bob Dylan, and you know how some of his writing was poetry, right? So like I'm thinking All Along the Watchtower, you know, for instance, and it made me think of other things, other songs that are poetic, that I consider poetry. And in one case, I know I was reading one of the biographies, so either Anthony, it was Anthony Kiedis's biography from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, his autobiography, and he was talking about Under the Bridge, the song Under the Bridge, about Los Angeles and where it came from. He said it really was just a poem. You know, he was not trying to write a song. It was a poem he wrote when he was, you know, in a really low place and just trying to encourage himself. And they put it to music afterward, you know, for that purpose. And when I think of poems / songs, I also think of Prince's Purple Rain, because I think that was like an incredible metaphor, worked very well, you know, over song format. And then to take it a little step further, Jill Scott, I know when she came out, she would say that she was a poet, but I can vouch. I was on the New Jersey scene, and she was a poet on the Philadelphia scene. And friends of mine who would come up to New Jersey from Philadelphia would talk about, you know, this poet Jill. So a lot of her stuff, and you know, and you can tell, like, you know, He Loves Me and all that stuff. It sounds like poems put to music. I think that I wouldn't even put it on the poet in terms of how poetry affects the population. I put it on the value. So to the extent of what we were just talking about with musicians, because it is already in the form of something that's valued, which is music, I think that it had some of those things that I mentioned earlier had more legs. To the extent that an Amanda Gorman is valued, that's what it's about. It's not that she didn't exist. It's not that poets such as herself, who are even her age, don't exist, but it's the value that people place on what they have to say. So to put a spotlight on someone who's as talented as she is, that's key, you know, to bringing poetry to the forefront. It's not that the poets are not writing in a way that communicates with people. It's just that the spotlight hasn't been shown on some of the ones who, you know, who can illuminate other people's lives, other people's situations. And James Baldwin has an essay about the poet and the people. You know, it's a little short couple of few paragraphs, and it's just like that's what I'm trying to communicate now, is that I mean, there's this antagonistic relationship between these poets who are trying to give the people this information and this knowledge that they could benefit from, and the people who don't value it. And I'll stop with one more reference, which is the funniest poetry reference to me of my lifetime. Is in addition to being involved in spoken word, I'm also involved in finance, right? And I have a degree in accounting, a master's in finance. And because of that pursuit, I was reading a book from 1776, which is kind of like a book that everyone who studies finance has to read, right? Which is Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And I was just reading it. I'm already out of school at this point, but I felt like I'm not official unless I read this book. And I was surprised at how many times in 1776, this person who's trying to define capitalism went back to talking about poets in the book. And in the book, you know, here it is, a book that was written, I don't know, 250 years ago, whatever, you know, 45 years ago. And he's like, people don't respect poets. No, that's not what he said. He said people respect them because they do something that the average person can't do. They communicate in ways that the average person can't communicate. But people don't want to pay for it. You know, so
Yeah, there you go.
he said it's very different than being a doctor or a lawyer, because in the sense of a doctor and lawyer, people not only admire their skill, but they're willing to pay them for it. And in the case of a poet, and this is The Wealth of Nations, he's defining capitalism, and he's talking about poetry in a couple of occasions. And he said, in the case of a poet, people admire their skill to the point that they wish they could do what the poet does. But when the poet asks for money, the people are disgusted. So, so I'll leave it with that. That was serendipity. I was not looking for a lesson about poets in a book about global, you know, finance from the 18th century.
That's funny. And unfortunately, I think that idea has stuck in the arts, and we have to try and find some way to turn that back around and regain capitalistic art for ourselves. So let's finish this up by having another piece from each of you. I'm just going to do it in the same order that we started with. Melanie, can you start us out with another piece?
Yes, I can. This one, we talked about the children and everybody on is educators. So I'll do this one that I had written for love. She be chocolate dipped dandelion. Here to heal the princess cut gallstones implanted in our uncertainties. She's black, diamond in roughness, born empress love. Live little girl princess in tutus and other dimensions. She still loves tea parties. See, she is here to offer unforeseen pinda. See, love ain't never known love of this kind, baby girl. She be life-changing, changing love on sight. God is powered, nurtured in the womb. See, together we be one trinity, forever products of each other. She chose us. See, we be more beautiful than any strife or love letter. Kindred spirits merged in the ethers. We are ready for you, small wonder. Lavender ink yellowing itself into sunlight's gleam. She's a lovely complexion, kissed by God, me, and Baba, our brown baby. Balance my aunt's tilted scales. Been misused for too long. We say, come here, girl. Abuse your powers. Get things back on track. She be generation shaker. Alpha laying pavement for all generations that follow. She is the pathway guided in love. She is the pathway guided in love.
Love it. I love it.
Thank you.
Paul.
When people think of Herman Melville, they tend to think of Moby Dick or Billy Budd. But he wrote a novel that I reread a couple years ago, and which led to this poem. And he read the novel is called The Confidence Man, and it's about a trip on the Mississippi River on a boat, and there are these various con men on the boat, but they're all really one person who takes many different shapes. And so this is a poem about masquerades and about con men in America, which go way the hell back in American history. And one of the closing lines in the book is, something further may follow from this masquerade. So I start out with, something further may follow from this masquerade. Pray tell, what does this mean? And why, sir, even ask the question? Doesn't everyone know? Well, for openers, masquerades, the closing word of Melville's ominous novel of confidence and chicanery, his Mississippi riverboat of fools, with its seemingly endless parade of avatars, knaves, charlatans, swindlers, scoundrels, cheats, liars, men always, in shrewd pursuit of filthy lucre. Each hell bent on fleecing his targets of whatever the chuckleheads may possess. Scam the name of the national pastime, things seldom being what they seem, i.e., herb doctors masquerading as bone setters, with all the charitable affectations as the sly boots con man might contrive. Peace itself is war and masquerade, Dryden opined a century or so, and a century or so later, Byron would echo, after all, what is a lie but the truth in masquerade? Oh, look, over there in the shadows, truth hides, trying to survive, yet she cannot. Too often espied, then distorted, disesteemed, disguised, redesigned, redeployed, and reinflicted. And we can only wonder what further will follow. Kind of a nice poem to follow the death of Bernie Madoff.
Charlatan number one.
Hustle to Hilly.
But we are a country of con men. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. Anyway, enough.
Yes. Taalam, how about you, Rob?
When you said comment, I kept thinking that politician is quite the euphemism for con man.
Yeah, yeah.
And something else that was said that kind of it made me smile because I'm a big Sopranos fan. So when you said Herman Melville, I thought Moby Dick, and then you said most people would think of Moby Dick. I'm like, oh my God, I'm common, right? And then you said Billy Budd, and then it just took me to this whole Sopranos episode where they were like talking about Billy Budd. I think AJ had to do a paper about him, and they were exploring like the homosexuality in the book and the
Captain Veer.
Yeah, so when you said that, it took me all the way back to The Sopranos and how I cannot wait for this movie to come out. Stopped by COVID. But his son plays him. So
with Gandolfini's son playing him, yeah.
Oh, so it's going to be, okay. Okay, poem. This poem is really short. I wrote this poem 20-something years ago. And I wrote it, and this goes to what we were discussing earlier about poetry's ability to heal. I wrote this poem to help myself because I was going through a lot. I was in my late 20s when I wrote it. Who made this world? Where my wife's man and her husband are not one and the same. Where poets are extremely talented, but some of them vain, act like they be willing to bust one in your brain, especially when they start gunning for name. I swear, the more things change, the further I go insane. I'm shell-shocked. I ain't no good for no woman no more. Perhaps I should just barricade myself and hear what my thought is. It don't seem correct to subject some innocent woman to my marriage-induced post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes I think this living room couch is gonna become my from here on out living quarters, and that eventually a lesser man would just do it. But I'd rather be crucified than commit suicide. And any hustler, whether they be dead or alive, would recognize that the look in my eyes is strictly do or die. Besides, people that commit suicide must not believe in God. Otherwise, they would understand that there's a rhyme and reasons why this life gets so hard. And they would put their nose to the grindstone and get used to the taste of their own blood, because life is a monster of a mobster, and you got to get your chops up if you wish to associate with that known thug. This world is like the Wizard of Oz, and until you show some heart, you don't never get shown no love. So when you're feeling desperate, thinking you done gave all you got to give, and you ask yourself, who made this world? The answer is simple. You and your actions did. And if you don't like the way that the life you live is changing, then isn't it just as obvious that you must live your life to change the way you live? Happiness is mathematic. That's all it is. Happiness is mathematic. That's all it is. Happiness is mathematic. And that's all. That's the point.
Wow. Wow. Fantastic. I have enjoyed this so much. I can't even tell you, Melanie, Paul, Taalam, thank you so much for being on Experience Talks. This has been truly special. I appreciate it.
I've known Melanie for the better part of 20 years, and I don't think I knew that that was why she was called Queen Sock. So like, that's when you get, you get some new information.
Right. It's funny because I was just thinking the first open mic that I went to ever in Los Angeles, I saw Taalam perform.
Wow.
I think
Wow.
her husband and her, they like my brother and sister. I think they just compliment me just out of nowhere. Just, I'm starting to wonder, like, really?
Yeah.
Well, Melanie, I wish I had been there too.
Right.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Cummins. And it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to hear you too.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Tim.
very much.
Thank
I
you
really
so much
appreciate
for
it.
having us.
This was really beautiful. Thank you all.
It was good to meet you, Dr. Cummins.
And you too. Thank you.
I'll talk to all of you soon, I hope. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Good evening.
Bye.